A beggar girl walks into a restaurant and asks a billionaire, "Can I trade my drawing for a plate of food? My mom hasn't eaten anything." When he sees the drawing, he is shocked and starts to cry. Valentino's was the kind of restaurant where people spoke in hushed tones, and the silverware barely made a sound against the fine porcelain. A place where servers moved like polite apparitions, and the bill never came to less than 3 figures. It was here that Miles Whittaker ate lunch every Tuesday, always at the same corner table, always alone. That afternoon, Miles was immersed in his private world of financial reports and performance charts. His grey eyes scanned numbers and tables, while his right hand made precise notes in the margins of the pages. The custom-made navy blue suit and the discreet but very expensive watch were the only clues as to who he really was. One of the richest men in the city, and probably also one of the loneliest. He had barely tasted the grilled salmon in front of him. The food was just a formality, an excuse to leave the office for an hour and think in peace. Having just turned 40, Miles had built a financial empire that many envied, but few knew what he had sacrificed to get there. "Sir, more wine." The waiter briefly interrupted his thoughts. Miles gave a negative gesture without taking his eyes off the papers. He didn't need anything else. He never did. This was his routine, his control, his perfect little bubble of order and predictability. Then the door of the restaurant opened, letting in not only a chilly afternoon breeze, but something completely unexpected in that controlled environment. First, it was the murmuring of the other customers that drew his attention. Then the sudden movement of the servers hurrying toward the entrance. Miles lifted his eyes from the documents and saw a child had entered the restaurant. She wasn't just any child with wealthy parents and designer clothes. She was a little girl of maybe 4 or 5 years old, wearing a worn-out dress that must have once been pink, but was now an undefined color. Her dark hair was tied in a messy ponytail, and her feet, Miles noticed with a strange pang in his chest, were bare. The manager quickly approached the girl, whispering something that seemed to be a gentle request for her to leave, but the little one seemed determined. In her hands, she clutched a colorful piece of paper as if it were a treasure. "But I just want to talk to someone," Miles heard the childish voice explain. "Just a minute." There was something in that voice, a mixture of courage and vulnerability, that made Miles raise his hand, a gesture the restaurant manager recognized immediately. "Is there a problem, Mr. Whittaker?" the man asked, approaching the table with the child a few steps behind. "Let her come," Miles said, surprising even himself with those words. The manager hesitated but ended up nodding and stepping back. The little girl looked at Miles, sizing him up with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed far older than her small frame. "Hi," she said, approaching the table cautiously but resolutely. "You look important." Miles couldn't help a faint smile at her straightforward observation. "And why do you think that?" he asked, putting the papers aside. "Because everyone's looking at you, and the man in the uniform called you sir with that special voice." She shrugged as if it were obvious. "My name is Ellie." "Miles," he replied, again surprising himself. It had been years since he introduced himself by his first name to a stranger. Ellie nodded as if she approved of the name, and then, without ceremony, held out the paper she was carrying. "I made this drawing," she announced. "Can I trade it for food? My mom hasn't eaten, there's nothing at home." The sentence, said so naturally, hit Miles like a punch in the gut. For a moment, he felt transported to another time, another place, another restaurant where he himself had been on the outside looking in. Are you hungry?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Ellie nodded emphatically. "And my mom too," she added, lowering her voice a bit. She said she'll eat later, but I know that means there's no food." Miles took the drawing she offered. It was simple and colorful, like any child's drawing, but what it portrayed hit him with unexpected force. There were 2 figures, clearly an adult woman and a child, sitting at a table in front of an empty plate. It wasn't an abstract or imagined scene. It was that child's reality, drawn in crayon. Ellie had given them sad expressions, a reality no child should have. Something blurred his vision. Miles blinked, confused, feeling moisture roll down his cheek. When a drop fell onto the drawing, slightly smudging the color, he realized he was crying. Miles Whitaker, the man who hadn't shed a tear even at his parents' funeral, was crying because of a child's drawing. Quickly, he wiped his face with the linen napkin, embarrassed and disoriented by this reaction he couldn't control. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the drawing and carefully placed it in his briefcase. "Thank you," he said. His voice choked. He cleared his throat to hide it. "Do you have a name?" "I already said it's Ellie," she replied with the simple logic of children. "Right, Ellie." Miles looked around. The entire restaurant seemed to be watching the scene, some with disapproval, others with curiosity. But at that moment, he no longer cared. "You said you're hungry." It wasn't a question. Ellie nodded, looking at him hopefully. Her eyes, big and dark, had an intensity that disarmed him. For the first time in many years, Miles felt the genuine impulse to help someone without calculating the benefits or consequences. "Would you like to sit down?" he offered, indicating the empty chair across from him. Ellie looked at her dirty feet and then at the velvet upholstered chair. "I think I'll get it dirty," she said, hesitant. Miles made a dismissive gesture. "It doesn't matter." She climbed onto the chair, her legs dangling without touching the floor. She looked curiously at Miles's half-untouched salmon. "That's salmon," he explained, lightly pushing the plate toward her. "Have you ever tried it?" Ellie shook her head, but her eyes remained fixed on the fish. Miles signaled to the waiter, "Bring another plate, please, and an orange juice." The waiter hesitated for a second, enough for Miles to notice, but soon nodded and left to fulfill the order. While they waited, Ellie swung her legs and looked around, observing the luxurious environment with curious eyes. "Do you work here?" she asked. Miles almost smiled. "No, I have a company. I work with money." "Money?" Her eyes lit up. "You must have a lot then. We don't have much." Her honesty disarmed him. Miles wasn't used to such direct conversations, without the layers of courtesy and falsehood that coated his world. "Where's your mom right now?" he asked, changing the subject. "Waiting," Ellie answered simply. "She couldn't find work today." The waiter returned with the plate and the juice. Miles cut a small piece of salmon and placed it on Ellie's plate. "Try it. If you don't like it, we can order something else." She picked up the fork carefully, as if afraid to break it, and tasted the fish. Her eyes widened in surprise. "It's good," she exclaimed, with a smile that transformed her face. Miles watched her eat with a voracity that confirmed just how hungry she was. She alternated between big gulps of juice and bites of fish, eating quickly, as if afraid the food might vanish at any moment. "Slow down," he gently advised. "There's plenty." Ellie slowed her pace, but her anxious eyes swept over the table, noticing the bread they hadn't touched and the dessert listed on the menu. "My mum, she needs to eat too," the girl said suddenly, as if remembering an important responsibility. Miles felt that strange pang in his chest again. "We can take food to her," he suggested. "What do you think she'd like?" Ellie's eyes lit up. "She likes chicken and potatoes and salad. She always says we need to eat green things to be strong." Miles signaled to the waiter again. "Prepare 2 full meals to go," he requested. "Chicken, potatoes, salad, and include dessert, the best you have." While they waited, Ellie told Miles about her mom, about how they lived in a small apartment, about how her mother looked for work every day. She spoke with a surprising naturalness for such a young child, without self-pity or drama, just stating facts as if everyone lived the same way. "My mom says things will get better soon," she concluded, wiping her mouth with the cloth napkin in a gesture clearly imitating the adults around her. "We just need to wait." The waiter returned with 2 white bags. The aroma wafting from them made Ellie's eyes widen. "All that is for me and my mum," Miles nodded, handing the bags to her. "Thank you, Mr. Miles," she exclaimed, holding the bags with both hands as if they were made of gold. My mom's going to be so happy. She turned to leave but stopped and looked back. Are you really going to keep my drawing? I will, Miles answered with a quick nod. Satisfied by his answer, Ellie headed for the exit, the bag swaying by her small frame. Miles watched until she disappeared through the door. Then, without a second thought, he stood up, left a $100 bill on the table and followed in the same direction. Once outside, he spotted Ellie already several yards ahead. An impulse he didn't understand and that, if he stopped to analyze, might even frighten him, made him follow her, keeping a safe distance so as not to alarm the child. Ellie walked with determination, her small bare feet stepping familiarly onto sidewalks that gradually became less well kept. The wide, clean streets of the financial district gave way to narrow alleyways and cracked sidewalks. The imposing buildings were replaced by older, more run-down structures. Miles, in his expensive suit and polished shoes, felt increasingly out of place, but he continued on. He noticed how Ellie deftly avoided potholes and obstacles, how she greeted some people along the way, a man sitting on a building stoop, a woman sweeping the entrance of a questionable-looking store. The further they went, the more evident the signs of poverty became. Children played in the street with improvised toys. Men and women sat on the steps of buildings, talking with the vacant stare of those who have lost hope. Miles felt a sharp guilt, realizing how he had never really seen this part of the city, despite it being only a few miles from his luxurious office. After about 20 minutes, Ellie finally stopped in front of an old brick building. Its facade had several broken windows, replaced by pieces of cardboard or plastic. The entryway was just a metal frame without a door. Ellie went inside and, driven by curiosity, Miles cautiously approached. He stopped in front of a ground-floor window that, fortunately, wasn't covered. From where he stood, he could partially see the interior of a small apartment. The place was clean despite the obvious poverty. There was little furniture, a simple table, 2 chairs, a mattress in the corner. A young woman, her back to the window, was hugging Ellie tightly as the girl spoke excitedly, showing her the bags of food. Miles couldn't hear their words, but he could see the woman's body trembling slightly, as if she were crying. She turned to grab the bags, and Miles could see her face, young, maybe 30, with features similar to Ellie's. Despite the visible exhaustion, there was a dignity in her posture, a quiet strength that impressed him. She opened one of the bags and brought her hands to her mouth in a gesture of surprise and emotion. Miles felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. He couldn't name it. It wasn't pity or charity. It was something deeper, more unsettling. It was recognition. Silently, he moved away from the window. They didn't need to know he was there, intruding on that intimate moment. Carefully, he took Ellie's drawing out of his briefcase and looked at it again. The 2 figures with the empty plate now seemed to look straight at him, like a mirror of a past he had tried to bury under layers of success and wealth. The drawing was done in crayon with simple but precise strokes. What impressed him most was the table, a brown rectangle with a white circle in the center, representing the empty plate. There was no food in the drawing, just 2 people waiting for something that never came. The simplicity of the scene was what made it so powerful. Miles folded the drawing carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. There was something about that piece of paper that touched him in a way no $1-million contract he signed every day ever had. The sun was starting to set as he walked back toward the city center, each step taking him back to the world of comfort and privilege he belonged to. But something had changed. That lunch, which should have been like any other, had turned into the beginning of something he still didn't fully understand. And, for the first time in many years, Miles Whitaker didn't have control over what was coming next. Surprisingly, it didn't bother him as much as it should have. The sound of his apartment door closing echoed through the empty space. Miles dropped his briefcase on the coffee table and loosened his tie with a brusque movement. The clock on the wall read just after 8 in the evening. He had spent the rest of the afternoon at the office, trying to focus on spreadsheets and meetings, but his mind kept returning to that little girl with bare feet. His apartment occupied the entire top floor of one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the urban lights beginning to punctuate the darkness. The minimalist decor in shades of grey and black had been chosen by a famous interior designer. Everything there screamed success, wealth, power. And yet, at that moment, it felt strangely empty. Miles went over to the bar and poured himself a whiskey. The first sip burned his throat. Normally, this ritual marked the end of another productive day, but tonight the alcohol tasted bitter. He returned to the living room and opened his briefcase, carefully removing Ellie's drawing. Under the soft glow of the recessed lights, the crayon colors looked even more vivid. Two figures, mother and daughter, seated before an empty plate. Miles walked over to the massive window and stood there, holding the drawing in one hand and the glass in the other, contemplating the city spread out at his feet. From up there, you couldn't see the poverty, the dirty streets, the dilapidated buildings. From that height, everything looked perfect and orderly. His eyes returned to the drawing. There was something in it, in the simplicity of those colored lines, that pierced through all the protective layers he had built up over the years. How could such a small child capture something as devastating as hunger so accurately? And then, without warning, the memory hit him. Miles was 8 years old. The apartment was small, just one room with a tiny bathroom. The cheap wooden table had 3 good legs, and one replaced by a stack of books. His mother sat across from him. Between them were 2 empty plates. "Are you sure you're not hungry?" he asked, noticing how she seemed thinner every day. "I already ate earlier," she lied, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm saving room for when dinner arrives." But he knew, even as a child, he knew there would be no dinner just as there had been no lunch. The last package of pasta had run out the day before. The milk, 3 days before that. A neighbor had promised to bring something after work, but it was already past 9 at night. His mother reached across the table and touched his fingers. "Tell me a story," she asked. "The one about the boy who builds a rocket." It was her strategy to distract him from the hunger. Miles began to narrate the story he had invented, about a boy who built a rocket from junkyard parts and traveled to a planet where food grew on trees and no one had to work 16 hours a day like his mother. As he spoke, he watched her face, which was looking more pale by the day, her eyes sunken in deep circles. She smiled and asked questions, pretending to be interested, pretending everything was okay, that it was normal to go days without eating. That night, lying on the thin mattress they shared, Miles made a promise to himself. One day, he would never be hungry again. He would never see his mother waste away. He would never be at the mercy of someone else's charity. One day, he would be so rich he could buy every restaurant in the city just to make sure there was always food on the table. Whiskey spilled as Miles's hand began to tremble. He didn't even notice the liquid dripping onto the expensive carpet. The memory, so vivid, had opened a wound he thought had long since healed. His mother died 3 years after that night, consumed by a disease a decent health plan might have treated. Miles ended up in the foster care system, passed through 3 temporary homes before being taken in by a couple of teachers who saw his potential. He studied like a man possessed, got scholarships, worked 3 jobs during college. Every step carefully planned so he would never return to that table with empty plates, and he succeeded. Miles Whitaker, the boy who had gone hungry, became one of the richest men in the country. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He never went hungry or cold again. He never needed anyone's help. However, looking at Ellie's drawing, he realized something had been lost along the way. At some point in his journey, he forgot the original reason he wanted to be rich. It wasn't just to ensure his own safety. It was so he would never again feel that helplessness, that pain of not being able to help the one he loved. Miles put the glass down on the table and sat on the couch, still holding the drawing. How long had he been hiding behind spreadsheets and acquisitions, ignoring that out there, just a few miles from his exclusive condominium? Children like Ellie and mothers like Joanne faced the same struggle he and his mother had faced decades ago. Hunger, humiliation, silent despair. A sob escaped his throat, surprising him. Miles hadn't cried since he was 15 when his school counselor told him it was impossible for someone with his background to get into Harvard. The tears felt strange, almost painful, as if they had been suppressed for so long they were now forcing their way out. He looked at the drawing again. The two colored figures, with their resigned expressions, seemed to stare at him with a silent question. "Now that you know, what are you going to do?" Miles stood abruptly. He couldn't just ignore it. He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen Ellie and her mother, not after being transported back to that empty table from his childhood. He needed to know more about them. He needed to understand how they ended up in that situation. He needed to do something. The next morning, Miles cancelled all his meetings. His assistant, used to seeing him follow a strict schedule for years, was stunned by the sudden decision, but Miles ignored his questions. There was something more important to do. Valentino's opened for lunch at 11:30. Miles arrived at 11 das, watching the employees bustling around preparing, cleaning tables, arranging silverware, polishing glasses. The manager, a middle-aged man named Gregory, was the first to notice him. "Mr. Whitaker, we weren't expecting you so early. Your usual table isn't—" "I'm not here to eat," Miles interrupted. "I need to talk to you, Gregory." "In private?" Gregory blinked, confused, but nodded and led Miles to the small office at the back of the restaurant. It was a modest space, with a simple desk, a computer, and some shelves holding accounting books and wine bottles. "How can I help you, sir?" Gregory asked, clearly worried. Customers like Miles Whitaker didn't show up unannounced asking for private conversations unless something was seriously wrong. "The child who was here yesterday," Miles began, sitting in the chair across from the desk. "The little girl with no shoes. Do you know who she is?" Gregory seemed to relax a bit, though he was still confused about the direction of the conversation. "Oh yes, it wasn't the first time she appeared. I've seen her a few times around the neighborhood. Do you know anything about her? About her mother?" The manager scratched his chin, thinking, "Not much. Her mother used to work at a cafe a few blocks from here. That place closed about 6 months ago during the downturn. Since then, I think she's been doing odd jobs, cleaning, that sort of thing." Miles nodded, absorbing the information. "What's her name? The mother's?" "Joanne, I believe. Joanne Coleman or Colson, something like that." "Joanne," Miles repeated, the name sounding familiar even though he had never met the woman. "And the girl, Ellie, is short for—" "Eleanor, maybe?" "Not sure." Gregory grew more intrigued by the questioning. "If I may ask, Mr. Whitaker, why the sudden interest?" Miles didn't answer immediately. How to explain something he didn't fully understand himself? How to say that this barefoot child had unearthed memories he had spent decades trying to forget? "Just curious," he finally replied. "Do you think anyone else here might know more about them? Perhaps Marina, one of the servers. She lives in that area. And Carlos, our kitchen assistant, also knows a lot of people in the neighborhood." Miles stood up. "I'd like to speak to them." Gregory hesitated. "Sir, we're about to open for lunch and—" Miles took out his wallet and pulled out a few $100 bills. This should make up for any inconvenience. Minutes later, Marina entered the office. She was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair tied in a bun and a spotless server's uniform. She seemed nervous to be alone with the famous billionaire. "Marina," Miles began, trying to sound less intimidating than he knew he was, "I want to know about a woman named Joanne and her daughter Ellie. Gregory said you might know them." The server relaxed a bit upon realizing she wasn't in trouble. "Yes, I know Joanne. We're not close, but we live in the same building. She moved in about 4 months ago, after being evicted from her previous apartment." "Evicted?" "Yeah, she couldn't pay the rent after losing her job at the cafe. A lot of people in the neighborhood are going through that since they started demolishing old buildings to build luxury condos. Miles felt a pang of guilt. His own investment firm had financed several of those urban revitalization projects. What else can you tell me about her? Marina thought for a moment. She's a good mum, very dedicated to Ellie, always polite, despite everything. I think she's educated, you know. She doesn't seem like someone who's always been poor. What kind of education? I heard she was a teacher. An elementary school teacher, I think. Miles nodded, taking in every detail. A teacher, someone who educated children, now saw her own child walking barefoot through the streets, asking strangers for food. How long have Ellie and her mum been struggling? Marina shrugged. Hard to say. I guess it got worse in recent months. Joanne was doing cleaning jobs, but it's unreliable work, you know. And with Ellie so young, she can't take just any schedule. Miles thanked Marina and then spoke briefly with Carlos, the kitchen assistant. But he didn't have much more to add. He only confirmed that Joanne had indeed been a teacher, and that she seemed like an educated woman who'd fallen on hard times. When he left the restaurant nearly an hour later, Miles had a clearer picture. Joanne Coleman, former elementary school teacher, single mother, evicted after losing her stable job, now surviving on temporary jobs while caring for Ellie. It was a story repeated thousands of times in the city. People who worked hard, masses were educated and employed, but who, with a twist of fate, a layoff, an illness, a divorce, found themselves teetering on the edge, an edge he knew all too well. On his way back to his office, Miles passed a newsstand. One headline caught his attention. Housing crisis worsens with new evictions in the East District. The East District, exactly where Ellie and Joanne lived, exactly where his company had invested millions in urban revitalization. He bought the newspaper and read it in the back seat of his car while his driver took him across town. The article talked about entire families being evicted to make way for new developments, about how rents had tripled in the area in the last 2 years, about how public schools were closing due to lack of funds, while new upscale restaurants opened every week. There was nothing in it that Miles didn't already know in theory, but now all of it had a face. The face of a barefoot girl with a drawing in her hands. The face of a mother who hugged her daughter in a dilapidated apartment, crying with relief because they had something to eat that day. When he arrived at his office on the top floor of one of the city's most towering skyscrapers, Miles didn't go straight to his room. He stopped in front of the huge window in the main lobby, looking out over the city below. Somewhere among those buildings, Joanne and Ellie were struggling to survive another day. His initial curiosity about them had turned into something deeper. It was as if, by helping them, he could finally help that little 8-year-old boy and his sick mother sitting in front of empty plates all those years ago. Miles pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed his assistant's number. Adam, I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Joanne Coleman. Former elementary school teacher, lives in the East District with her young daughter, Eleanor. He paused. And cancel my appointments for the rest of the week. I have something important to deal with. He hung up before Adam could protest. For the first time in years, Miles Whitaker didn't know exactly what his next step would be, and strangely, it didn't bother him. He felt a growing determination, a purpose he hadn't experienced in a long time. Ellie's drawing, now carefully stored in his desk drawer, had done more than stir up painful memories. It had awakened something he thought had been dormant forever, the ability to care. The first basket was delivered on a Tuesday morning. Miles had been meticulous in the planning. He hired a discreet delivery company, one that didn't use flashy uniforms or marked vehicles. He paid extra for anonymity and made sure no one would mention his name. In the instructions, he specified that the delivery should be made at 7 in the morning, a time when Joanne would be awake but likely not yet out looking for work. The basket wasn't extravagant. He didn't want to startle them with an overly grand gesture. It had the basics: rice, beans, pasta, tomato sauce, cooking oil, some fresh vegetables, fruit, milk, bread, butter, eggs. Enough food for a week. He also included some chocolate for Ellie and a small bottle of perfume for Joanne, a personal touch he hoped wouldn't seem too intrusive. Across the street, inside a car with tinted windows, Miles watched. He saw the deliveryman leave the basket by the door and ring the bell before walking away quickly. He saw the door open and Joanne appear, looking confused. He saw her eyes widen upon realizing what was on her doorstep. He saw how she looked around, searching for who might have left it, before pulling the basket inside. There was no card, no note, no indication of who the donor was. Miles preferred it that way. He didn't want gratitude or recognition. He wasn't doing it to feel good about himself or to ease some guilt. He did it because, well, he needed to. The next week, he sent another basket. Along with food, he added hygiene products, a couple of new blankets. He had researched and found out winter was approaching and the heating in those old apartments was unreliable. And a small teddy bear for Ellie. The third time out, he also included some clothes. He had managed to find out their sizes through his assistant, who hired private investigators. For a charity project, Adam explained, feeling awkward for lying, but it would be even stranger to explain the truth. The deliveries continued for a month, always on Tuesdays, always at 7 in the morning, always with Miles observing from afar. It became a ritual, something he looked forward to with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt for anything in years. He noticed subtle changes every week. Joanne's appearance gradually improved, fewer dark circles under her eyes, her hair looking healthier, cleaner clothes. Ellie also seemed healthier, her cheeks fuller, her smile more frequent when she appeared at the door beside her mom. On that particular morning, the 5th delivery, Miles decided to do something different. He would deliver the basket himself, not to reveal his identity, but because he felt an inexplicable need to be closer, to see their reactions firsthand, not from the safe distance of a parked car. He dressed simply, jeans, a t-shirt, a plain jacket, nothing that would reveal his true financial status. He arrived a bit before 7, carrying the heavy basket in his arms. This time, it included not only the usual items, but also a small sketchbook and colored pencils for Ellie, and a book for Joanne, a poetry collection his assistant discovered she enjoyed, based on some old social media posts. He approached the door silently, set the basket down, and rang the bell. He turned to leave quickly, like the deliveryman did, but wasn't fast enough. "Hey, food guy." The child's voice made him freeze. He turned slowly to see Ellie standing in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. Her eyes, however, were wide awake and staring at him with a mix of surprise and joy. "Ellie? Who is it?" Joanne's voice came from inside the apartment. "It's the food guy, Mom." Except this time he didn't run away so fast. Miles felt the urge to run, but his feet seemed glued to the ground. Ellie came closer to him, her bare feet just like the first time he saw her. "Why do you drop things off and then leave?" she asked, tilting her head to the side, curious. "Don't you want to talk to us?" Before Miles could answer, Joanne appeared in the doorway. She was also in pajamas, a simple cotton set, her hair in a messy bun. Upon recognizing him, her expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, and then to something Miles couldn't identify, mistrust perhaps. "Mr. Whitaker?" she said, and the familiarity with which she said his name surprised him. "You know me?" he asked, uncomfortable. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "It's hard not to recognize the face of one of the richest men in the city," she replied, "especially when he shows up in the news at least once a week." Miles felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. He had planned everything so carefully to remain anonymous, and yet here he was, identified the moment Joanne laid eyes on him. "So it's you who's been sending the baskets," Joanne continued. It wasn't a question. Miles nodded, unable to deny the obvious. "You know my mom?" Ellie asked, looking up at him with those big, inquisitive eyes that seemed to see far beneath the surface. "No, sweetie," Joanne answered before Miles could say anything. "Mr. Whitaker and I have never formally met. But he knows me. He gave me food at that fancy restaurant, Ellie reminded her mother, as if she needed to be reminded. She turned back to Miles. Thanks for the things you send. Mom cried about the perfume, and I loved the teddy bear. Did you know I named him Theo? The simplicity with which the child expressed gratitude made Miles feel oddly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to such frankness, this total absence of pretense or ulterior motive. In his world, gratitude always came with expectations. He began, not sure what to say. It was nothing. It was something, Ellie countered with childlike directness. It was a lot. We barely had anything to eat before. Now we have a ton, and Mom doesn't cry at night anymore, thinking I can't hear her. Miles saw Joanne flush, embarrassed by her daughter's revelation. Ellie, honey, why don't you take the basket inside? Joanne suggested softly. The girl nodded and dragged the basket inside with some difficulty, leaving Miles and Joanne alone in the doorway. An awkward silence fell between them. Why? Joanne finally asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Miles averted his gaze. I just wanted to help. People like you don't help people like us without a reason, she replied, not in bitterness but with a fatigued resignation. What do you want in return? The question caught him off guard, not because it was unfair, but because he didn't have a clear answer himself. What did he want? Why was he doing this? It wasn't the calculated charity he did for fundraisers, where he donated large sums to abstract causes and received public applause. Nothing, he finally said. I don't want anything in return. Joanne studied him for a long moment, as though trying to decipher a complex puzzle. Well, thank you anyway, she said at last. The baskets, they've made a huge difference. Miles nodded, relieved he didn't have to explain further. Food guy. Ellie's voice interrupted the moment. She had returned and was holding something in her hands. I made this for you. She held out a piece of paper. Miles took it and felt a lump form in his throat. It was another drawing similar to the first, but with one crucial difference. This time there were 3 people sitting at the table, clearly Ellie, her mother, and him, and the plate in the center was full, overflowing with colorful food. That's us, Ellie explained, pointing to the figures. You, me, and my mum. With real food. Miles stared at the drawing for a long moment, unable to speak. Something inside him, some carefully guarded barrier, seemed to be dissolving. Thank you, he managed to say finally. Will you have dinner with us one day? Ellie asked hopefully. I told Mum you should. Miles looked at Joanne, who seemed equally embarrassed and amused by her daughter's candor. Ellie has a gift for direct invitations, she commented with a small smile. Miles hesitated. Social dinners were part of his life, of course. Business dinners, charity events, occasions where every word was calculated, every move had a purpose. But a simple dinner with no agenda, with a woman and a child he barely knew. Maybe someday. Ellie's face lit up. Promise. He wanted to say no. He wanted to keep a safe distance, remain just the food guy who left anonymous baskets. But something in those hopeful eyes disarmed him completely. I promise, he answered, surprising himself. In the days that followed, Miles continued sending baskets, but now without the pretense of anonymity. Sometimes he delivered them himself. Other times, when inevitable meetings and commitments prevented him, he went back to the old system of discreet delivery men. With each visit, Ellie greeted him with growing enthusiasm. He was no longer just the food guy, but simply Miles, said with a familiarity he found oddly comforting. The girl started waiting for him on Tuesday mornings, often already posted by the door when he arrived. It was cold last night, she told him one morning, helping carry a small bag of fruit. Mum put 3 blankets on me, the ones you sent. On another occasion, did you know I get scared when it's dark? Mom leaves a small light on, but sometimes the power goes out. Or yet another time, yesterday I dreamed we had a big house with a garden, just like in storybooks. We lived there, me, Mom, and you too. Each small revelation, each fragment of her life, touched Miles in a way he couldn't explain. It was as if, through Ellie's eyes, he saw the world in a completely new way, simpler, more honest, without the layers of cynicism and calculation he was used to. Joanne, for her part, kept a polite distance. She always thanked him, always showed courtesy, but rarely shared anything personal. Miles could sense her caution, her reluctance to fully trust this wealthy stranger who, for reasons unknown, had decided to help them, until one particularly cold morning, when he arrived with the usual basket plus some winter coats. She invited him in. "Just for a coffee," she offered, noticing his hesitation. "It's cold out there." The apartment was small but surprisingly cozy. Miles noticed the personal touches that turned the precarious space into a home. Ellie's drawings on the walls, small potted plants on the windowsills, books neatly arranged on makeshift shelves. A serene dignity permeated every corner, despite the evident poverty. "How did you find us?" Joanne asked as she served a simple coffee in chipped mugs. "After that day at the restaurant, I mean." Miles recounted how he had followed Ellie home, feeling suddenly ashamed to admit what, he realized now, might be seen as an invasion of privacy. To his surprise, Joanne didn't seem offended. "Then it was meant to be," she said with a small smile. "Or at least that's what Ellie would say. She's convinced you're some kind of guardian angel sent to us." "I'm far from an angel," Miles replied, uncomfortable with the comparison. "I know," Joanne said, her gaze suddenly more intense. "Angels don't have scars in their eyes like you do." The remark caught him off guard. There was something in the way she looked at him that suggested a deeper understanding than he was prepared to admit. Ellie entered the kitchen at that moment, breaking the tension. She was holding another drawing and offered it to Miles. "I made another one," she announced proudly. "It's us in the park." Miles looked at the paper. 3 figures holding hands under a big yellow sun, all smiling. Simple, direct, honest, like everything about Ellie. "It's beautiful," he said, and this time it was true, not for its technique or aesthetics, but for the feeling conveyed by those colorful lines, a simplicity he had lost long ago. "You're my friend now," Ellie declared with the absolute certainty only children possess. "Mom thinks so too, she just doesn't say it." Miles looked at Joanne, who averted her eyes, a faint blush creeping up her neck. "It would be an honor to be your friend, Ellie," he replied, feeling something strange and light in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in so long he barely recognized it. It was peace, not the absence of conflict or the satisfaction of a job well done. It was something deeper, more fundamental, as if, for a brief moment, he was exactly where he needed to be. When he left the apartment that morning, Miles carried the new drawing carefully in his briefcase, alongside the first one. Already on the sidewalk, he heard Ellie's voice calling from the window. "See you next Tuesday, friend," she shouted, waving energetically. Miles waved back, a genuine smile breaking across his face, a smile that wasn't calculated, wasn't a social tool, had no purpose other than to show something that was growing inside him. As he walked back to his car, Miles realized that for the first time in years, maybe decades, he was actually looking forward to the next Tuesday. Miles paused at Joanne's apartment door, feeling a strange sensation in his stomach. It wasn't the nervousness he felt before billion-dollar deals or crucial investor meetings. It was something simpler, more human. The anxiety of someone about to have an honest conversation. It was Sunday, almost noon. There was no basket this time. It wasn't Tuesday, the usual delivery day, and Miles wasn't there as the food guy. He was there as himself, for a conversation he knew was inevitable. He took a deep breath and knocked. He heard light footsteps inside and Ellie's voice shouting, "I'll get it," followed by Joanne's more measured tone saying, "Wait, check who it is first." The door opened partially, held by a security chain. Joanne's eye appeared in the crack, widening slightly when she recognized him. "Mr. Whitaker, we weren't expecting you today." "Miles, please," he corrected her. "May I come in? I'd like to talk." There was hesitation, Miles could sense her distrust, tangible as a physical barrier between them. He didn't blame her. In her place, he'd also be wary of a rich stranger suddenly showing up in her life. "Please," he added, and there was a sincerity in his voice he himself barely recognized. The door closed briefly and then reopened fully. Joanne stood there, wearing simple jeans and a blue cotton blouse, her hair pulled into a low ponytail. She looked younger like this, less tired than on the early mornings of the basket deliveries. Behind her, Ellie bounced with excitement. "Miles is here," the girl exclaimed, running to him as soon as he stepped in. "Did you bring any drawings for me?" Miles smiled, kneeling down to her level. "Not today, Ellie. I came to talk to your mom. Grown-up stuff, you know?" The girl's face showed brief disappointment, but she soon nodded with the seriousness of someone who understands important matters. "Can I show you my new drawings in the meantime?" she asked, already pulling him by the hand toward a small table in the corner of the living room. "Ellie," Joanne interjected in that universal tone mothers use, "why don't you finish your own drawing while I speak with Miles?" The girl let out a theatrical sigh, but obeyed, moving to the table where colored papers were scattered. Joanne pointed to the worn-out sofa in the middle of the room. "Please, have a seat. I can offer you coffee." "That's about all we have for unexpected guests." "I don't need anything," Miles said, sitting down. "I didn't come to be served." She nodded and sat at the opposite end of the sofa, keeping a safe distance. For a few moments, neither spoke. The only sound in the apartment was Ellie's pencil moving across the paper. "Why are you doing this?" Joanne finally asked, her voice low enough that Ellie couldn't hear. "The baskets, the gifts. What do you want from us?" Miles had rehearsed this conversation in his mind, but now all his prepared sentences felt artificial, inadequate. "I don't want anything," he answered sincerely. "At first it was just an impulse. After seeing Ellie in that restaurant and following you both home, something just clicked." "Does charity make you feel good about yourself?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, just frank. "It's not charity," Miles replied, perhaps too quickly, at least not in the traditional sense. "Then what is it?" Miles hesitated. How to explain something he himself didn't fully grasp? "Connection, maybe," he said at last. "Ellie reminded me of something. Someone. She reminded me there's a world beyond contracts and acquisitions." Joanne studied him for a long moment, as if trying to see beyond the polished facade he always presented to the world. "You know how strange this looks, right? A billionaire suddenly interested in the life of a single mother and her daughter. People talk, you know. In this building, making up conspiracy theories is everyone's favorite pastime when you're poor." "What theories?" Miles asked, genuinely curious. Joanne shrugged. "The most popular is that Ellie is your secret daughter." Miles let out a short laugh. "I guess that would explain her dark hair, but not much else. Another theory is that you're interested in me, either romantically or less romantically." She kept her tone casual, but a faint blush crept up her neck. "What do you think?" Miles asked. "I think it's more complicated than that," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I think there's something broken in you, just like there is in me, and somehow Ellie saw it." Her directness took him by surprise. People didn't talk to Miles Whitaker like that. They never suggested he was broken. They were always careful, always calculating what he wanted to hear. "I'm not here to play savior," he said after a moment. "I know you don't need one, even if things are tough. I came as maybe an ally, someone who can help while you rebuild what you lost." Joanne didn't respond immediately. She looked at Ellie, absorbed in her drawings, then back at Miles. "Why?" she asked again, but this time there was something different in her voice. Not distrust, but a genuine need to understand. "Because no one helped me when I needed it," Miles answered, surprising himself with the raw honesty of that admission. Joanne blinked, as if not expecting that response. "I'm not asking for your life story," she said more gently. "I get that we all have our secrets." "It's not a secret," Miles said. It's just not something I usually share. Across the room, Ellie stood up from her drawing table, apparently tired of coloring. She approached them on the sofa. To Miles's surprise, she took his hand, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Are you having the hard talk?" she asked, looking from one to the other. Joanne gave a small smile. "How do you know it's a hard talk?" "Because you both have that face," Ellie said with the innate wisdom of children. "The face grown-ups get when they need to talk about complicated things." Miles felt a tightness in his chest. Her perception was remarkable. Ellie squeezed his hand as if sensing his tension. "It's okay," she said, consoling him. "Sometimes hard talks are good. Mom says that." Joanne watched the interaction with an expression Miles couldn't fully decipher. There was caution, but also something like admiration for how easily Ellie formed connections. "Maybe," Joanne began after a long moment, "you could tell us a little about yourself, Miles. If we're going to be allies, we should know each other better." Miles nodded, still aware of Ellie's small hand holding his. "What do you want to know?" "Anything you want to share. Something real." Miles took a deep breath. It was hard. In his world, truths were like rare coins, too valuable to be handed out freely. But there was something about this worn-out sofa, this modest apartment, this mother and daughter that allowed an openness he rarely permitted himself. "I grew up poor," he began, his voice low. "Not the kind of relative poverty people mention offhand. Real poverty, the kind where you go hungry." Joanne didn't look surprised, as if she had already suspected. "My mom did what she could, sometimes 3 jobs, but it was never enough. She got sick when I was 11, died when I was 14. We didn't have insurance, no savings, nothing." Ellie squeezed his hand a little tighter, as if she sensed the weight of his memories. "I went to foster homes, 3 of them, until a couple of teachers took me in. They saw potential in me, pushed me to study. I got scholarships, worked through college. The rest is the public story. Whitaker finances, acquisitions, investments, success. And the emptiness," Joanne added gently. Miles looked at her, surprised. "You fill your life with work, money, power," she continued, "but there's still an emptiness. The hungry boy is still in there." Her words hit Miles with unexpected force. No one had ever articulated so clearly what he had felt for years, maybe decades. "Yes," he finally admitted. "The emptiness." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with mutual recognition. Joanne was looking at him differently now, as if truly seeing him for the first time. "My turn," she said after a moment. "You already know a lot about us, I suppose. Probably have complete dossiers." Miles didn't deny it. His assistant had indeed compiled detailed information about Joanne and Ellie. "But maybe it's different hearing it from me," she continued. "I was a teacher for 8 years, elementary education. I loved my job. Even with the low pay and difficult conditions, I had a simple but stable life." She looked at Ellie, who was listening intently. "I got pregnant with Ellie at 26. Her dad, well, he wasn't ready to be a dad. He left before she was even born. I kept working until my last month of pregnancy and went back as soon as Ellie was old enough for daycare." Ellie nodded, as if to confirm the story she already knew well. "Everything worked out, in a way. It wasn't easy, but we were okay. Then the school where I worked closed, budget cuts, they said. I tried to find another position, but there were hundreds of unemployed teachers. I took temporary jobs, cleaning, anything." Miles noticed how her hands tensed slightly as she spoke. Money wasn't enough. Rent went up. Prices went up. We got evicted. Moved to a smaller place, then an even smaller one. Finally, we ended up here. She gestured vaguely around the apartment. "It's not what I dreamed for Ellie, but it's what we have for now." "Mom is the best teacher in the world," Ellie interjected firmly. "She teaches me everything. Letters, numbers, songs. I wish other kids could learn from her too." Joanne smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair. My best student, without a doubt. I miss playing with other kids, Ellie said, looking at Miles. At my old school, I had friends. Now I only see kids at the park sometimes, but we don't stay long because Mom has to look for work. Miles felt a pang of sadness hearing that. Those childhood experiences, friends, playtime, a sense of belonging, were so fundamental, so formative. Ellie was being deprived of them by circumstances beyond her control. And Mom's always sad, Ellie continued with disarming frankness. She smiles at me, but I know she's sad when she thinks I'm not looking. Ellie, Joanne exclaimed, blushing. What? It's true, the girl defended herself. You said we should always tell the truth. There are appropriate times for certain truths, Joanne gently explained. It's okay, Miles interjected. I appreciate her honesty. It's refreshing. Ellie smiled, satisfied by his approval. I just want to see Mom happy again, she added. Really happy, not just pretending. Miles noticed how Joanne looked both touched and embarrassed by her daughter's statement. There was an admirable dynamic between them. A mother trying to shield her daughter from harsh realities. A daughter too perceptive to be deceived by forced smiles. That's why I draw so much, Ellie continued. Happy drawings. I thought if I made a lot of them, maybe they'd become real. The simplicity of that childlike logic moved Miles deeply. There was a purity, an incorruptible hope in her words, something he had long since lost. Sometimes, he said, looking at Ellie, drawings really can become real in a way. You think? Her eyes lit up. I do. Joanne watched their interaction silently, her expression now softer, her initial wariness noticeably reduced. What exactly are you proposing, Miles? She finally asked. How would this alliance work? Miles thought for a moment. He could simply offer money. That would be the easiest route. A generous check, maybe a new apartment, bills paid. But he knew instinctively that wasn't what Joanne wanted or needed. You're a teacher, he began, a qualified professional with experience. What you need isn't charity, but an opportunity, a path back to the stability you once had. She nodded slowly. And you have connections, she added, understanding where he was headed. I do, Miles confirmed. But I don't just want to get you a job. That would be presumptuous. I want to help open doors, create possibilities. The rest is up to you. And in return? Joanne asked, still cautious. In return? Miles hesitated. What did he really want? In return, maybe we can keep having these conversations. Maybe I can visit occasionally. Maybe we can have that dinner Ellie keeps talking about. Joanne studied him for a long moment. Are you looking for a replacement family, Mr. Whitaker? She asked, but there was no malice in her voice, just genuine curiosity. I'm looking for a human connection, he answered honestly. Something I lost long ago while becoming who I am today. Ellie, still holding his hand, smiled at him. We can be your friends, she said simply. Right, Mum. Joanne hesitated, but something in her eyes softened. Maybe, she replied, a small smile forming at the corners of her lips. One step at a time. Miles nodded, feeling something odd in his chest. It wasn't exactly happiness or relief. It was more like possibility. A door opening to a path he hadn't even known he wanted to walk. Ellie squeezed his hand once more, as if sealing a silent agreement, and Miles, for the first time in years, felt truly seen. The Hope Community Center was located about 15 blocks from Joanne's apartment, in an area marking the transition between impoverished neighborhoods and the more developed part of the city. It was a red brick building, old but well-maintained, with a small front garden and a simple playground on the side. During the day, the place bustled with activity. Children running around, seniors playing chess on concrete tables, teenagers attending art and music workshops. At night, it offered adult literacy classes, basic job training, and various support groups. Miles knew the place well. 3 years earlier, when the local government threatened to cut funding, he discreetly intervened through one of his foundations, By his standards, it wasn't a huge investment, just enough to keep the doors open and expand a few services. But it made all the difference to the local community. On that Wednesday morning, Miles parked his unassuming car, not the Bentley he normally used, outside the center. Dorothy Warren, the director, was already waiting at the entrance. She was a 60-year-old black woman with short white hair and a warm smile that belied an iron will. She had been running the center for over 2 decades and knew every person who walked through its doors by name. "Mr. Whitaker," she greeted, extending her hand. "What a pleasant surprise. You usually only come for the annual meetings." Miles shook her hand, feeling genuine admiration for this woman who dedicated her life to helping others. "Dorothy, I need a favor." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued, but gestured for him to follow her inside. Her office was small and cluttered with folders, books, and children's drawings. On the walls were photos of generations of people who had passed through the center, some now lawyers, nurses, technicians, teachers. "You know I rarely ask for anything in return for supporting the Hope Foundation," Miles began, sitting in the wooden chair across from her desk. "Which is why I'm curious," Dorothy replied, folding her arms. "What can I do for you?" Miles explained about Joanne, her background as a teacher, her current situation, her struggle to support Ellie. He didn't mention how he met her, or the personal bond he was forming with them. He presented it as just another case of someone talented who needed a chance. Dorothy listened attentively, nodding occasionally. When he finished, she remained silent for a few moments, thinking it over. "We have a vacancy," she finally said. "We lost Ms. Liu last month. She got a job at a private school. We have a group of kids ages 5 to 7 without a permanent teacher, only temporary volunteers." Miles felt a wave of relief, but kept his expression neutral. "It's a full-time position," Dorothy continued. "We don't pay much, as you know, but we offer a basic health plan and her daughter could attend our daycare for free." "When could she start?" "If her resume fits, immediately." "But," Dorothy added, giving him a sharp look, "it has to be on her own merits. We don't hire people just on recommendation, even if it comes from our main financial backer." Miles nodded, respecting her stance. "I wouldn't expect anything less. I can guarantee she's qualified. I'll send her resume today." Dorothy stood, indicating the meeting was over. "You've never asked for anything all these years, Mr. Whitaker. There must be something special about this woman." Miles didn't reply directly. He simply thanked her and said goodbye. On his way out, he watched children playing on the playground. He imagined Ellie here, making friends, experiencing a normal childhood despite the circumstances. He imagined Joanne teaching, using her talents, regaining her professional dignity. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was using his money and influence for something truly meaningful. When Miles told Joanne about the vacancy, her reaction was complex. First came surprise, then an almost instinctive caution, as if suspecting some hidden manipulation. Finally, when she realized it was a legitimate opportunity, that she'd still need to go through an interview and prove her qualifications, her expression changed. "You really did this for me?" she asked in a low voice, so Ellie, who was drawing in the bedroom, wouldn't hear. "I just opened a door," Miles replied. "You'll have to walk through it on your own." Joanne studied him for a moment, as if assessing the sincerity of his intentions. Something in her eyes shifted, a barrier falling. "Thank you," she said simply. Joanne's interview with Dorothy took place 2 days later. Miles didn't attend nor ask for details. He only knew from a brief message from Joanne that she'd been hired and would start the following Monday. The Sunday before Joanne's first day at work, Miles was invited to dinner at the small apartment. It was the first time he had received a formal invitation, rather than a casual coffee offer during basket deliveries. "It's a celebration," Ellie explained over the phone when she called to invite him. "Mom's making special pasta." The special pasta, Miles discovered upon arrival, was simply spaghetti with homemade tomato sauce and herbs. But the table was set with care, using their best plates. A mismatched set, but clean and neatly arranged. There was even a candle in the center, and Ellie wore a dress Miles recognized from one of the baskets he had sent. "It's not much," Joanne said with a hint of self-consciousness as she served the plates. "But it's made with gratitude." It turned out to be one of the best meals Miles had ever eaten, not for its sophistication, obviously, but for the authenticity of the moment. Ellie's excitement, Joanne's restrained nervousness, and the flowing conversation about hopes and possibilities for the near future. "I'll meet other kids," Ellie exclaimed between forkfuls. "Mom said I can stay at the daycare while she teaches. I'll have friends again." "And you'll behave," Joanne reminded her with a smile. "Remember, I'm the new employee there." "I always behave," Ellie protested, making a face that suggested otherwise. Miles watched the interaction between mother and daughter with a strange feeling in his chest. It was a mix of satisfaction at having helped them and a sense of longing for something he'd never had. A family like this, affectionate and united, despite the hardships. After dinner, while Ellie brushed her teeth before bed, Joanne served Miles a cup of coffee. "I'm nervous," she admitted, sitting at the table. "It's been almost a year since I last taught officially." "It's like riding a bike," Miles said. "You never really forget." "I hope you're right." She paused. "Dorothy told me you've been supporting the center for years." Miles nodded. "One of the few things I do that really matters." "Why?" The question was simple, but Miles had to think before responding. "I grew up in a neighborhood like this. If there had been a place like Hope Community Center, maybe my mom would have gotten help. Maybe I would have had a safe place to stay after school instead of being alone in the apartment." Joanne looked at him with understanding, not pity. "You're a strange man, Miles Whitaker. Your name is on skyscrapers and billion-dollar funds, but you care about special pasta and children's drawings." Miles gave a small smile. "Maybe I'm trying to remember who I was before the skyscrapers." That night, when Miles said goodbye, Ellie hugged him spontaneously. It was the first time that happened, and he was momentarily stunned before awkwardly returning the hug. "Tomorrow is the start of our new life," the girl said, her voice sleepy. "Will you come visit us at the center?" "If your mom allows it," Miles replied, looking at Joanne. She nodded. "That would be nice," she said simply. In the weeks that followed, a new routine emerged. Joanne taught every morning and some afternoons at the Hope Community Center, while Ellie attended daycare there. Miles, defying his years of rigid work habits, rearranged his schedule to visit the center at least twice a week. Sometimes, he took Joanne and Ellie out to lunch somewhere simple in the neighborhood. Other times, he joined them at the center's park, where Ellie played with other children. Occasionally, he was invited to dinner at their apartment, which gradually acquired small improvements. New curtains, a less worn-out sofa, a sturdier table. During these meetings, Miles discovered a simplicity he had lost long ago. Conversations with no hidden agendas, spontaneous laughter, the pleasure of watching Ellie run around the park, or Joanne happily explaining how one of her students finally learned to read. One day, while Joanne was finishing up in her classroom after a lesson, Miles and Ellie sat on the playground swings, which were nearly empty at the end of the afternoon. "When I grow up," Ellie announced, gently swaying on the swing, "I want to be a teacher like my mum." "Really?" Miles asked, clumsily trying to swing alongside her. "Why?" "Because teachers help people discover new things. And when you discover new things, you become happier." The simple yet profound logic impressed him. "How you think learning new things makes people happy?" Ellie nodded emphatically. "Sure, when I learned to tie my shoes all by myself, I got really happy. And when Mom found out about her new job, she got happy too." Miles smiled, appreciating the clarity of a child's reasoning. "How about you?" Ellie asked, looking at him curiously. "Do you learn new things at your job?" Miles thought for a moment. His work involved complex analyses, multi-million-dollar negotiations, strategies to increase the value of his businesses. But did he truly learn new things? Not as much as I should, he finally admitted. That's why you didn't used to smile, Ellie concluded confidently. But now you smile more. Miles blinked, surprised by her observation. It was true. Since entering their lives, something had changed within him. He found himself smiling more, sleeping better, feeling less empty. I'm afraid of the dark, Ellie confessed suddenly, changing the subject with typical childlike ease. But only a little bit. It used to be worse, but now we have the lights on most of the time. Miles remembered how Joanne had mentioned frequent power outages due to unpaid bills, a problem he had discreetly resolved by covering her overdue utility costs without her knowledge. We all have fears, he responded. Even you. Especially me. Ellie stopped swinging, genuinely surprised. What are you afraid of? Monsters? Ghosts? Miles gave a sad smile. I'm afraid of being alone, I think. Of not mattering to anyone. The words slipped out before he could filter them. It was a truth he barely admitted to himself, much less to a 4-year-old. But Ellie just nodded as if it made perfect sense. But you're not alone now, she said simply. You have me and my mom. Miles felt something warm and heavy in his chest, a feeling without a name, a mixture of gratitude, tenderness, and a kind of hope he hadn't felt since childhood. That's true, he managed to say, and when you come over for dinner, Mom gets happy too, Ellie added, starting to swing again. She smiles in that special way. Miles refrained from asking the obvious question about what that special way looked like, respecting Joanne's privacy, even though Ellie would probably tell him without reservation. In the distance, they saw Joanne leaving the building, waving at them. There was a lightness in her steps now, a regained confidence that grew with each day on the job. Miles noticed again how attractive she was when not weighed down by endless worries. Ready to go? She asked, approaching. I thought we might do something different today. There's a small theater nearby showing an animated film. If it's not too late for your schedule, Miles, I'd love to, he replied, getting off the swing. He had a teleconference with investors at 7, but it could wait. Some things were starting to seem more important than meetings and spreadsheets. As they walked together to the theater, Ellie between them holding both their hands, Miles realized these simple moments, the casual dinners, the playground chats, the unplanned outings, were filling the emptiness Joanne had so accurately identified. The hungry little boy was still there, inside him, probably always would be. But now that boy wasn't alone anymore. There was a kind-hearted teacher and a bright little girl who, without knowing it, were teaching him to rediscover the world. And as Ellie had said, learning new things made people happier. Miles was in his office on the top floor of the Whitaker building, looking out through the panoramic window at the city spread below. It was nearly evening, and the lights were starting to glow, creating that urban constellation pattern that usually calmed him. But not today. His calendar was open on the computer screen. Over the past 2 months, more and more appointments had been cancelled or rescheduled. Important meetings with investors, strategic lunches, even a trip to Tokyo to negotiate the acquisition of a tech company, all to make room for visits to the Hope Community Center, dinners with Joanne and Ellie, weekends at the park. Earlier, Adam, his assistant, had come in and placed a folder on his desk, wearing an expression that was equal parts curiosity and concern. Quarterly figures, sir, and the board would like to confirm your attendance at next Monday's meeting. Miles had merely nodded without committing. The board meeting clashed with the end-of-semester presentation at the center, where Joanne's class would put on a small play. Ellie had a role. She would be a flower that grew when watered with knowledge. The metaphor was simple, but she was so excited she talked about it non-stop. Now alone, Miles confronted a truth he had been avoiding. He was getting too involved. What had started as an impulse to help, a gesture of humanity triggered by memories of his own past, had become something much more complex. Joanne and Ellie were now occupying a space in his life no one else ever had. What am I doing? He murmured, swiveling his chair away from the city view. His gaze fell on the opposite wall, which once held only a very expensive abstract painting he'd bought because it matched the decor. Now, next to it, were Ellie's drawings. The first one with the empty plate, then the one depicting the three of them with a full plate, and several others she had produced over the past months, a growing gallery documenting the evolution of their relationship. Miles got up and walked over to the drawings. Was he just trying to fill a void, trying to artificially build the family he never had? And if he was, so what? He wasn't forcing the situation. Joanne and Ellie seemed to appreciate his presence as much as he appreciated theirs. But there was something else troubling him, a fear he hadn't yet spoken aloud, not even to himself. What if, once they were fully stable and secure, they realized they didn't need him? What if they saw that a man with his background, his habits, his emotional baggage, wasn't someone they wanted in their lives? His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Joanne. "Miles, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Nothing that can't wait," he replied, feeling that familiar lightness whenever he heard her voice. "Is something wrong?" "Not exactly. I just wanted to confirm if you're coming tomorrow for the rehearsal of the presentation. Ellie's excited to show you her flower transformation." Miles smiled, despite the doubts that had been consuming him seconds before. "I wouldn't miss it. I'll be there at 4. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Miles, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Are you okay? You seem different lately. Maybe more distant." Her perception startled him. He thought he'd hidden his doubts well. "I'm fine," he responded automatically. "Just some work issues." "I understand," Joanne said, though her tone suggested she didn't fully believe him. "Well, I don't want to keep you. See you tomorrow." After he hung up, Miles sat back down, feeling a strange heaviness in his chest. He lied to investors, competitors, and reporters without hesitation when needed. Why did lying to Joanne bother him so much? Perhaps because he wanted to be genuine with her, and the truth was too complicated to share. How could he explain that he was afraid of becoming too important in their lives, that he feared disappointing them, that he sometimes wondered if he was trying to buy affection with financial help? The next day, the rehearsal went well. The children recited their lines with only a few adorable stumbles, and Ellie executed her flower transformation with such focus that the tip of her tongue peeked out the corner of her mouth as she slowly rose from the floor, arms stretched high like opening petals. Afterwards, while Joanne helped organize the small props with other teachers, Miles waited in the community garden. The day was pleasant, with a light breeze rustling the leaves of the trees. A few parents chatted in small groups, children ran across the lawn, and elderly volunteers played chess on concrete tables. Miles observed everything with a sense of being simultaneously inside and outside that world. He was part of it now, but still felt like a stranger, a visitor from a different reality. That was when he noticed Ellie approaching. She walked slowly, unlike her usual energetic run. There was something serious in her expression, almost solemn, that seemed out of place on her little face. "Hi, Flower," Miles greeted her with a smile. "You were amazing in rehearsal." Ellie didn't smile back. She stopped in front of him, looking at him with those big dark eyes that always seemed to see more than they should. "Can I talk to you?" she asked quietly. "Seriously?" "Of course," Miles replied, alarmed by her tone. "What's wrong?" Ellie climbed onto the bench beside him, but kept a small distance, her hands nervously playing with the hem of her dress. "Will you keep visiting us even when everything gets better? Or will you disappear like my dad did?" The question hit Miles like a physical blow. For an instant, he couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the question, but the tone, a mix of fear and resignation, as if she were already bracing herself for disappointment. "Ellie," he began, not sure how to go on. "Everything's getting better," she continued, staring at her hands. "Mom has a job. We have food now. Soon we won't need help. Then you'll leave, right?" Miles realized, with painful clarity, what was really going on. To Ellie, he wasn't just the food guy or even an occasional friend. Somehow, over the past months, he had become a figure of safety, affection and trust, someone important. And with that came a fear he hadn't considered, the fear of abandonment. "It's just," Ellie went on, her voice now almost a whisper. "Before I was born, my mom said my dad promised he'd stay with us forever. But he left. And then, when I was small, there was a nice neighbor who sometimes played with me. He left too. Then the school closed, and my friends left." The pain in that little voice struck him to his core. Miles had never really thought about the trauma the girl carried. At just 4 years old, she already had a list of people who had vanished from her life, and now she feared he was just another name on that list. "Ellie, look at me," he said softly, turning to face her completely. The girl lifted her eyes, and Miles saw they were brimming with tears. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, with a conviction that surprised even himself. "It doesn't matter if you need help or not. I'm here because I want to be with you. Because I care about you and your mom. Promise," she asked, with the intensity that only children can put into a single word. Miles hesitated for a split second. Promises weren't something he made lightly. In fact, he avoided them in his personal life because he knew how easily they could be broken and how much they could hurt. But Ellie's gaze demanded total honesty. "I promise," he finally said, "I won't disappear from your life." Something seemed to ease in Ellie's small body. She still didn't smile, but the tension subsided. "Even if you and Mom argue, even then, even if you get super busy at work, even if I get super busy, even if you meet someone else you like spending time with more than us." Miles gave a sad smile. What an insecure question. How much pain it revealed for someone so small. "Ellie, there is no one I'd rather spend time with than you and your mom." Her eyes widened, as if that was hard to believe. "But you're a billionaire," she said, clearly having picked up the word from adults. "You know lots of important people." "I do," Miles agreed. "But important people aren't always people who are important to us. You understand the difference?" Ellie thought for a moment, then slowly nodded. "Like Principal Dorothy. She's important at the center, but she's not as important to me as my mom." "Exactly." They fell silent for a moment, Ellie processing everything and Miles reflecting on the commitment he had just made. It wasn't just a promise to comfort a child, it was a rearranging of priorities, an acknowledgement of the place Joanne and Ellie now held in his life. The doubts that had consumed him in his office still existed, but now they felt smaller compared to the reality of this moment. If he was filling a void, maybe he was also, for the first time, allowing himself to build something genuine, something that couldn't be measured in net worth or power. "My mom likes you," Ellie said suddenly, with that childlike frankness. "She smiles differently when you're around, and she gets sad when you go." Miles didn't know how to respond. The idea that Joanne might feel something for him beyond gratitude and cautious friendship was something he tried not to consider. Too complicated, too risky. "I think your mum finished with the props," he said, noticing Joanne stepping out of the building. "Shall we go find her?" Ellie didn't move. Instead, she leaned to the side, resting her head on Miles's shoulder in a gesture so natural and confident that it caught him completely off guard. "Thanks, friend," she said softly. The word friend, spoken with such simplicity and trust, broke something inside Miles. A barrier he hadn't realized he was still keeping up. A final protective wall around his heart. He felt his eyes grow hot, an unfiltered emotion washing over him. Slowly, awkwardly, he wrapped his arm around Ellie's small shoulders, pulling her into a proper hug. It was the first time he had ever hugged someone this way, not as a formal greeting or a social gesture, but as genuine affection. He felt the small, fragile body against his, the absolute trust she showed in that embrace. In that moment, all doubts seemed to fade away. The fear of getting too close, of creating expectations, of potentially letting them down, all still existed, but were now overshadowed by something bigger. A realization that, in some improbable way, he had found a true connection, a bond that went beyond material help or gratitude. "I'm grateful for you too, Ellie," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "More than you can imagine." When they finally pulled away, Miles saw Joanne standing a few feet away, watching them with an expression that blended tenderness and something more complex, perhaps the same fear he had felt about depending on someone emotionally, about being vulnerable to possible pain. Their eyes met over Ellie's head, and something unspoken was exchanged, a mutual acknowledgement that, despite all fears and uncertainties, they had created something important and valuable between them, something worth risking for. Ellie took Miles's hand and began to pull him toward her mother, now skipping, her mood restored by the promise and shared embrace. "Mom!" she called out. "Miles said he's never leaving, even if everything turns out okay." Joanne smiled, a slightly trembling smile, and Miles realized she too was fighting to hold back emotion. "That's quite a promise," she remarked, looking directly at Miles. "One I intend to keep," he replied, meeting her gaze. As they walked together back to the building, Miles felt a calm settle within him. The doubts and fears were still there, as they always would be. But he now knew with a certainty that transcended logic that he had found something worth fighting for, not just helping Joanne and Ellie, but being part of their lives. And maybe, just maybe, allowing them to be part of his as well. The old warehouse had been completely transformed. The previously faded, time-worn brick walls were now clean and painted in soft tones. The tall windows, carefully restored, let in natural light that flooded the open space. The wooden floor, sanded and varnished, gleamed under simple but elegant pendant lamps. In the center of the main hall, round tables were set up with white tablecloths and wildflower arrangements. A small stage had been assembled at one end, with a podium and a blue banner stretched overhead. "Roots of Tomorrow, official inauguration." Miles stood off to one side, quietly observing the final preparations. He wore a well-tailored navy blue suit, but had left off the tie he would normally wear at corporate events. This was not an occasion for excessive formality. It was something more important. Nervous, Joanne's voice surprised him. She approached, wearing a simple but elegant dress, her hair down, framing a face that in recent months had lost its perpetual look of worry. "A little," Miles admitted. "It's different from inaugurating a commercial building or announcing a merger. Because it matters more," she finished with an understanding smile. Miles nodded. Joanne always seemed to know exactly what he was feeling, even when he struggled to express it. "Where's Ellie?" he asked, noticing the absence of the ever-energetic girl. "She's doing a final check to make sure the kids' drawings are perfectly aligned on the reception wall," Joanne replied with a soft laugh. "She's taking her role as junior art director very seriously." Miles smiled. In the 6 months since that conversation in the center's garden, much had changed. The idea for Roots of Tomorrow had come about naturally one evening over dinner at Joanne's apartment. They'd been discussing how to expand her impact at the center, how to reach more families in need. When Miles mentioned an abandoned property his company owned on the borderline between the city's wealthy and poor areas, "What if we create something of our own?" Joanne had suggested. "Something that combines education, food, and support. A place where families can receive not just material help, but also dignity and prospects." Ellie's excitement about the idea was immediate. "We can make a big place with lots of food, like the baskets you used to bring, but for everyone." The child's simple vision perfectly captured the project's essence. Miles mobilized resources, Joanne developed the educational methodology, and in less than 6 months, the Roots of Tomorrow Foundation had become a reality. "It's time," Joanne said, checking her watch. "Guests are arriving." Miles drew a deep breath, trying to quell the emotion rising inside him. This wasn't just another inauguration. It was the realization of something that gave new meaning to his life. The guests began entering the hall. They weren't the usual faces Miles saw at corporate events. CEOs, investors, politicians seeking connections. These were mostly people from the community, families helped by the Hope Community Center, educators, volunteers, local shop owners who had donated materials or services for the renovation. Dorothy Warren, the center's director, arrived with some of the children who had been Joanne's students. At the entrance, each guest received a small handmade tree-shaped pin, symbol of the foundation, crafted by mothers who attended the first arts and crafts workshop. Adam Tree, Miles's assistant, was barely recognizable in casual clothes, discreetly coordinating the catering staff who served drinks and snacks. Miles watched him with gratitude. The man who once organized only his corporate life was now an enthusiastic ally, dedicating many of his free hours to making sure everything ran smoothly. Finally, Ellie appeared, running toward Miles and Joanne. She wore a blue dress that matched Miles's suit and her mother's dress, a detail she had insisted on, so they looked like a real team. Her hair was styled in an elaborate braid, and a homemade badge proclaimed her as an official helper. "Everything's ready," she announced, eyes shining with excitement. "You have to see how nice it looks. I put the special drawing right at the entrance, like you asked." Miles knew exactly which drawing she meant. The first one Ellie had given him at the restaurant, the one showing her and her mom sitting in front of an empty plate. Now it was framed in a simple but tasteful frame, hung in a place of honor in the foundation's lobby, a constant reminder of where it all began. "Let's go check," Miles said, taking Ellie's hand. Joanne joined them, and the three walked to the entrance. The drawing was illuminated by a small spotlight, its simple colors contrasting against the white wall. Next to it hung a modest plaque explaining, "The seed that gave rise to roots of tomorrow. Artist, Eleanor Coleman, 4 years old." Joanne paused in front of the image, her eyes glistening with tears. "Who would have thought a crayon drawing on a rumpled piece of paper would lead us here?" she whispered, her voice choked. "I always knew my drawings were magical," Ellie declared with the unwavering confidence of a child. "That's why I made so many." Miles and Joanne exchanged a fond smile. The adjacent wall was covered with more of Ellie's drawings, and those by the children who would be part of the Foundation's programs, a colorful explosion of hope and possibility. The inauguration ceremony was simple and moving. After a brief explanation of the Foundation's goals, to provide nutritious meals, educational support, job training, and emotional counseling to families in need, it was time for Miles's speech. He stepped onto the small stage, looking out at the diverse audience. He recognized some faces, others were new, but all were united by a common purpose. A lump formed in his throat, but it wasn't nervousness. It was something deeper, more genuine. "I didn't prepare a formal speech," he began, his tone softer than his usual corporate presentations, because Roots of Tomorrow didn't come from a carefully devised strategy or market analysis. It came from an encounter. His eyes found Ellie's, seated in the front row next to her mother. A few months ago, a brave little girl walked into a fancy restaurant with a drawing in her hands. She wanted to trade it for food. Her mother was hungry. Miles paused, feeling emotions swell. "That drawing, you can see it at the entrance, changed my life. Not because it showed me hunger or inequality. I already knew those existed, even though I pretended not to see. The drawing showed me courage, dignity, and above all, possibility." He looked at Joanne, who watched him with a mix of pride and emotion. Meeting Ellie and Joanne Coleman reminded me of something I'd long forgotten. Helping isn't just about giving things to people. It's about recognizing their humanity, their capability, their potential. It's about creating opportunities so they can pave their own way. A murmur of approval swept through the crowd. Roots of Tomorrow isn't a traditional charity. It's a space of transformation. Here, there won't be donors and beneficiaries, just a community working together. A community where everyone has something to offer and something to receive. Miles glanced away from the audience for a moment, trying to steady his emotions so his voice wouldn't falter. Personally, he continued more quietly, I learned that real wealth isn't in bank accounts or skyscrapers. It's in genuine human connections. It's in seeing a child like Ellie get to draw her future with whatever colors she chooses, not just the ones imposed by circumstance. He paused again, this time looking straight at Joanne. And it's in finding people like Joanne Coleman, our educational coordinator, who taught me that starting over isn't a sign of weakness, but of extraordinary strength. Joanne smiled back at him, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. So today, we're not just inaugurating a building or a social program. We're opening a new way of building bridges between different realities. A place where stories like Ellie and Joanne's can have different endings written by them. When Miles finished, there wasn't the formal, distant applause typical of corporate events. Instead, Ellie ran up and hugged him tightly. That triggered an outburst of spontaneous and genuine cheering, which only grew louder when Joanne joined them on stage. The little makeshift family right there before everyone perfectly symbolized the spirit of the foundation, unlikely connections forging new paths and possibilities. The rest of the ceremony flowed in a celebratory mood. Ellie, with help from Miles and Joanne, cut the inaugural ribbon. People toured the newly opened facility, exploring the industrial kitchen where nutritious meals would be prepared, the multi-purpose rooms for classes and workshops, the communal area stocked with books and toys, and the backyard garden already sprouting vegetables. Joanne, in her role as educational coordinator, guided small groups, explaining the methodology to be used. Her confidence and knowledge impressed everyone. It was hard to believe that, just a few months earlier, she had been struggling to find temporary cleaning jobs. Ellie, for her part, took on the role of junior hostess with adorable seriousness, proudly showing off the drawings on the walls, handing out tree pins to anyone who didn't have one yet, and explaining with disarming sincerity to anyone who would listen. We didn't have food before, but now we help other people have food and learn new things. Miles used to be sad, and now he laughs more. And my mom is the smartest teacher in the world. By late afternoon, when most of the guests had gone, only a few newly hired employees remained to tidy up, and the little family at the center of it all. It was perfect, Joanne said, sitting next to Miles on a bench in the garden. Nearby, Ellie was examining a small butterfly that had landed among the vegetables. It was, Miles agreed, more than I ever imagined. They watched Ellie for a moment in comfortable silence. Despite the long, busy day, she still had seemingly endless energy to explore. You know what I thought during your speech? Joanne asked, turning to Miles. What? That sometimes the most unlikely people find each other exactly when they need to, like the universe knows what it's doing. Miles smiled. Before meeting Joanne and Ellie, he would have dismissed such an idea as naive sentimentality. Now, he wasn't so sure. Do you believe that? In fate? Joanne shrugged. I'm not sure if it's fate. Maybe it's just openness. Being open to see beyond the obvious, to embrace unexpected connections. Like a lonely billionaire and an unemployed teacher. And a 5-year-old artist with a knack for changing lives, Joanne finished, glancing at Ellie, who was now drawing something in the dirt with a stick. Miles watched them both for a moment. It was both strange and completely natural, this feeling that had grown inside him, this certainty of belonging, of a shared purpose. Can we go home? Ellie asked, finally coming over, her tired eyes belying the boundless energy her small frame still tried to project. I'm hungry. Of course, you sweetie, Joanne said, standing. We all deserve a good rest after today. Is Miles coming to dinner with us? Ellie asked, looking at him hopefully. Before he could answer, Joanne intervened. I was actually thinking we could try something different tonight. Miles looked at her, curious. I thought we could have dinner at Miles's place, Joanne continued. If he's inviting us, of course. It's been so long, and we've never seen where he lives. The suggestion caught Miles off guard. His penthouse had never really been a home, just a stylish, impersonal space where he slept between long workdays. But there was something about Joanne and Ellie filling that space with their presence that felt undeniably right. "I'd love that," he replied. "But I should warn you, I'm not nearly as good a cook as you are." "We can cook together," Joanne suggested. "Ellie is an excellent kitchen helper, aren't you?" The girl nodded eagerly, her fatigue momentarily forgotten at the prospect of a new adventure. "Can I see your drawings?" she asked Miles. "You must have lots of drawings at your house, right?" Miles and Joanne exchanged amused looks. Ellie still couldn't fathom a world where adults didn't spend significant time drawing. "Actually, I don't have many drawings," Miles admitted, "but I do have a nice view of the city, and a lot of empty space that might need some new pictures." Ellie's eyes sparkled at the idea. "I can make special drawings just for your house." "I'd love that," Miles said wholeheartedly. As they walked together to the parking area, Miles reflected on how his life had changed so completely in just a few months. The man who once measured success by acquisitions and profit margins now found purpose in smiles, crayon drawings, and the daily effort to build something money could never buy. That night, in his minimalist and formerly lonely apartment, Miles watched Joanne and Ellie in the kitchen. They moved with a natural familiarity, as if the space had always been theirs, too. Ellie chattered endlessly about the inauguration, the butterfly in the garden, the pictures she planned to make to decorate the really white walls. Joanne prepared a simple but fragrant meal, occasionally exchanging knowing glances with Miles. When they finally sat down to eat, not at the formal dining table but at the kitchen counter, cozier and more intimate, Miles felt a quiet certainty settle within him. The Roots of Tomorrow Foundation would be important, helping hundreds of families and changing lives. But his true new horizon was right here, at this kitchen counter, with a resilient teacher and a spirited little girl who, by some miraculous twist of fate or chance, had become his family. "I think we should make a toast," Miles suggested, raising his glass of juice in solidarity with Ellie, who insisted juice was more colorful and fun than other drinks. "What to?" Joanne asked, also raising her glass. Miles thought for a moment. "To the empty tables that are now full," he said, "and not just with food." Ellie didn't fully grasp the meaning, but raised her glass anyway, delighted to join in the adult ritual. Joanne, however, understood perfectly. Her eyes met Miles's, and in that glance was an entire future of possibilities. "To the full tables," she echoed softly, "and to the drawings that became reality,